Now, the rest of the story. By the mid-17th century, it had gotten way out of hand in England. The authorities had no choice but to consider making it against the law. Far as anyone knew, it had never been banned before anywhere, and if the British government did make it illegal, would enforcement be feasible? According to the observers upon whose written recollections history is based, this suspect something had often led to rioting in the streets, had even caused church services to be invaded by unruly mobs. Abomination, prostitution, profanity, the Puritan authorities called it. And at last, in 1652, by an official act, it was abolished. Again in England, it was strictly legally taboo, beginning in 1652. And yet, as today's law enforcement agencies have difficulty restricting the use of certain drugs, British authorities of more than 300 years ago found the prohibition of one public habit to be almost impossible. I think we can say this: after 1652, it was no longer visible. It was, as much of today's drugs and gambling and pornography and prostitution, driven underground. That is, it still happened, just not openly. 7 years later, in 1659, it was outlawed in the New World of New England. According to this legislation, designed for preventing disorders arising in several places within this jurisdiction, offenders would be fined. A penalty more harsh, quite probably any penalty at all, would perhaps have been unnecessary in these staunch Puritan surroundings, for indeed, as stated in the New England law of 1659, such an offense was to the great dishonor of God. What adds to the fascination of these historical footnotes is that apparently the aforementioned offense was an offense in no other place and at no other time in all history. I say apparently, for such research could be endless, and yet we've explored the customs and laws past and present of Russia and China and Japan and Europe and Africa and South America. We can't find it any place prohibited. Nowhere can we find a tradition enforced or a law on the books like those of Old England and New England 300 years ago. Anywhere else at any time in recorded history, you could have gotten away with it, but not there and not then. It was legally prohibited in England for 8 years, between 1652 and 1660, and it was prohibited for 22 years, between 1659 and 1681, in the New World. Remember that. It was prohibited in our New World. Yet so powerfully was this practice protested in the land that was to become the United States of America, that the effects of its suppression were to be felt for 2 centuries more. In the early 1900s, no student at the Boston Latin School could have told you what it was. And still in 1847, no New England college would officially recognize its existence, a condition perpetuated throughout the professional community of Boston until 1856, and throughout the public academic community of that city until 1870. And yet, despite the one-time threat imposed by colonial legislation, despite the distant cries of paganism, like our contemporary consternation over commercialization, Americans simply could not, still cannot kick the habit of observing Christmas. And now, you know the rest of the story.